Okay, we're live.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch of our Learning for Collective Action series on dyslexia, current legislation, and its impact in schools. Today, we are going to be talking about and trying to understand dyslexia and addressing some common misconceptions. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides from my computer so that we can go ahead and get started. And then I'm going to introduce myself. If you're already here and joining us, would love to hear about who you are, where you're from, what kind of lens that you're bringing into this work, as I am going to share that in a second as well. Perfect. All right, the screen is shared. If we can go ahead and pop that up onto our Facebook Live screen. And in sharing a little bit about me, so hello, my name is Amber Gustafson. I am a Teach for America Detroit Policy Fellow who works with 313 Reads. And before becoming this fellow, I was a secondary education educator. I taught English language arts as well as English as a second or other language for 5 years, though that was in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm really excited to be back in my home state of Michigan and working with 313 Reads on some amazing impact. So excited to see you, Emily. Thank you for joining us. Would love to hear anyone else, who you are, where you're from, and how you're joining us today.
I'm really excited to see Tana's here. Tana is a Michigan Teacher of the Year, and she also recently spoke at the Michigan Reading Association and did some literacy essentials training with Detroit Public Television. So thanks so much for being here today, Tana.
Amazing. So excited to have you, Tana. All right. In the interest of time, to make sure that we can continue to move on, I'm going to move on to our next opening activity. So in 313 Reads, we really like to norm the practice of having a restorative check-in. This usually looks like an opening kind of response to a question that really grounds us and makes sure that we're all kind of on a more even playing field. I really want this to seem like you all have amazing questions and interacting with our amazing panelists today. So first, I'm going to start with, what is bringing you joy today? If you can put that in the comments of our Facebook Live, that would be fantastic. I'll go ahead and start. What's bringing me joy today? The sun is shining. This feels amazing after the snow that we've received this past week. And I am so grateful for the little things that really boost my mood, like the sun shining. Some of our panelists, if they would like to go ahead and speak on this restorative check-in as well, what is bringing you all joy today?
Well, as a native Texan, I'm excited that it's going to be 76 finally toward the end of April. Yay. We are definitely Michiganders focused on the weather and how it brings us joy.
I had a student this morning, 8 a.m., a student I tutor, and we did some assessment work with her, getting ready for her IEP that happened just before this meeting. And the progress she made, I was just cheering. We were high-fiving, and that was a great way to start the day.
I love starting the day with kids. And the sun, the weather, we need it, especially in this weird in between kind of spring, pre-summer time. All right, we are going to go ahead and move on to the introduction. Again, this is the launch of our 5-part series, so we're really excited to go through this. First, if you are watching this Facebook Live and you have not gone to this link in order to register for the series, that's totally okay. However, if you would like to be entered in to receive this book, Dyslexia, Wrestling with an Octopus, 10 Ways to Help Your Child, please go to this tiny URL link and sign in. I have all of the emails pre-registered in there. I would love to add yours by the end of this session when we do the raffle so that you can be entered in to win. So if you have not already, please go there and enter in to win. tinyurl.com/LFCA Series 1. tinyurl.com/LFCA Series 1. Okay, so today we are focused on the first part of our series. This is Understanding Dyslexia and Addressing Common Misconceptions. We actually have 5 parts in total to this series. The next one is going to be about dyslexia policy and what it could mean for our children in schools. The third session is on dyslexia identification, maybe as a tool for literacy equity. The fourth session that we received a lot of questions about in some of our registration is evidence-based and culturally sustaining practices to support children with dyslexia. We agree that this is so important that it actually needed its own session separate from today's. And then fifth, this is specifically for 313 Reads program partners, but this is about using Acadians Learning Online to identify readers that are at risk for dyslexia. So again, I don't want anyone to think that we are not addressing some of their questions. Specifically, we wanted to make sure that we are focusing on understanding dyslexia today, and later we will be focusing more specifically on evidence-based and culturally sustaining practices. I am going to pass it over to Dr. Leah Van Bell to give us a little bit more of a context for this entire series within 313 Reads. Here you go, Leah.
Thanks so much, Amber. I'm Leah, and I serve as the Executive Director of the 313 Reads Collective Impact Coalition. I'm really grateful to be here today with everyone. So one of the things that we're really focused on in 313 Reads is literacy, equity, and justice. We hear a lot about our children in Detroit, not being at grade level, that there's an achievement gap. And we take a really strong stance that it's an opportunity and achievement gap. So we're committed to making sure that our children have access to what they need to be successful, and also that educators have access to what they need. We operate from a space knowing that teachers and schools are working really hard, and summer and out of school time programs are working really hard. And so we want to just say, how can we be a value add and add more tools to that tool belt collectively? When we think about literacy equity, we talk about sort of like national averages and state averages for literacy. Here in Detroit, we're large geographically. We also have a lot of variability. So while the overall third grade reading rate hovers around 10% post-COVID, we have zip codes that even prior to COVID had third grade reading proficiency under 4%, meaning under 4% of our babies were reading proficiently as indicated by the MSTEP and other measures. So clearly a lot of work to do here. And again, we're coming from the space that our children, families, communities, organizations are brilliant and can do anything when we have access to the resources and supports. So today, our goal is to help us all understand better what is dyslexia, what is not dyslexia, and then across this series to think about, okay, so how do we screen for that? And how do we support children who have dyslexia? We're excited about the legislation that's pending in the Senate and excited to have Susan with us, who helped write that, and want to learn, like, what are the implications for that? So this whole series, which Amber has been our champion in building out, is really to help us collectively learn more so we can all have better tools and we can better serve our children. And I'll pass it back to you, Amber. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah, for that amazing introduction to the whole series. In continuing with introductions, I would love to take this time to introduce today's amazing panelists. So first, we have Ms. Kristin Dwyer, Master's of Education. She's also a co-founder of Brain Friendly Reading. She co-founded BFR by pulling on her extensive background in the science of reading as a Montessorian and Orton Gillingham tutor, evaluating and field testing reading practices and strategies. Kristin codified their approach into a unique sequence of instructional strategies that she has used to train hundreds of teachers, both individually and district-wide, new tutors, teachers, and other lay people, as well as parents and volunteers over the last 2 years. Working with defeated, struggling readers really motivates Kristin to keep working tirelessly to provide training and individualized coaching at low or no cost. Why? Because educational equality isn't possible until we take responsibility for teaching all children to learn how to read. Thank you so much, Kristin, for being with us today.
I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Next, we have Ms. Corrine Z. Lyons, who is a literacy educator and teacher equity lead. Corrine is a native Detroiter who teaches middle school ELA at Sampson Weber Academy in Detroit Public Schools Community District. She serves as a teacher lead for equity, planning and facilitating staff professional development on topics related to educational equity. Corrine is passionate about collaborating with fellow educators to reimagine education and ensure equitable access to academic success for marginalized students. As a graduate of the prestigious Cass Technical High School, Corrine attended Wayne State University, receiving a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and a Bachelor of Arts in Communication Studies before earning a Master of Arts in Teaching in Secondary Education. She is certified in the state of Michigan to teach English language arts and speech. Corrine is also an active member of AKA, or Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, the first Greek letter sorority founded in the US for Black women. She says Sundays are made for God, innovative lesson planning, coffee, and music are Netflix favorites. Thank you so much, Corrine, for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oops. And finally, we have Ms. Susan Ward Schmidt, who is a board member of the Michigan chapter of the International Dyslexia Association. A special education teacher since 1979, Susan's expertise in dyslexia is grounded in advanced training at the Michigan Dyslexia Institute and over 20 years applying that knowledge with students who are 5 to 70 years old. Her experience working in the Michigan legislature has equipped her to help lead the effort to move dyslexia legislation in our state. Again, thank you so much, Susan, for being here with us today.
Great to be here.
We are going to keep moving right along into our first section, which is specifically around understanding dyslexia. These first couple of questions I am going to be asking to Kristin. So Kristin, first, what is dyslexia?
Well, dyslexia is a brain-based learning difference with an unexpected difficulty in reading. That's the really simplified way of understanding this larger definition that the International Dyslexia Association has. And we can break that down a little bit by saying that we understand that dyslexia is neurobiological in origin. That means that it has to do with the brain. It's not a vision issue. It's not an intelligence issue. It's not a try harder, focus more issue. That in the brain, there are parts of the brain that have to talk to each other for reading to happen. And with children with dyslexia, we can see through MRI imaging that those pathways, those neural pathways between those parts of the brain are undeveloped. We can even see that in very young children. So this idea that dyslexia is something that's also really common is important for people to understand, that up to maybe 20% of the population is dyslexic. It could be lower, but those characteristics of dyslexia extend across a large group of children. That means that several children in every classroom are dyslexic. And that teachers also can understand that dyslexia is genetic, that it runs in families. If dad is genetic or has dyslexia or mom has dyslexia, about the children in the family have about a 1/3% chance of being dyslexic. So often those adults aren't diagnosed, but we can see that that genetic component is there for the children. A lot of children who are dyslexic also may be diagnosed with ADD. About 30 to 50% of those children have that comorbidity, which means that they go together. And a lot of the characteristics of like struggling with the reading, having difficulty with reading because they're having a hard time focusing on the words, in addition to fatiguing really quickly, that those impact each other. But overall, dyslexia is a reading issue. It's an issue with reading, it's an issue with writing, and it's an issue with spelling.
Thank you so much for that amazing comprehensive answer, especially talking about the percentage within the population, right? We see a lot of like up to 20%, it could be as low as 5%, but it is not something that only affects just a couple of people within our population. You mentioned some specific characteristics. Can you go in a little bit more detail on common observable characteristics of dyslexia?
Sure. So when we think about dyslexia, the way that's easiest to think about it is that certain parts of the brain have to talk to each other for reading to happen. And those parts of the brain, when those neural pathways I talked about are not developed very well, that those parts of the brain can't talk to each other. And what does that look like? It looks like in a child that they have trouble with single word decoding. Why do they have trouble with single word decoding of unfamiliar words? Well, they have trouble with it because they don't know the sounds that are in their oral language and how they attach to the written letters. So we call that a letter sound or a sound symbol correspondence. And that's weak with children who are struggling with reading. They don't know when they look at a word that they haven't memorized and stored in another part of their brain, this basket of words that they've memorized. When they look at that unfamiliar word and they try to decode it or read it, they don't know what sounds go with those letters and they can't blend those sounds together. The reverse is also true. When they go to spell, they might have memorized a bunch of words and stored those spellings of those words in the Broca's region of the brain. But when they go to spell, they want to break maybe a big word down into its syllables. And then they need to be able to break the syllables into the sounds. They don't understand that process, nor do they have that sound symbol connection to be able to do that work. So those foundational skills that are common among dyslexics impact also their fluency and their reading comprehension. And often you'll see that show up as children get older. They may be able to pass as a normal reader, but the piece that's most important for people to be familiar with is that unexpected, that word unexpected, that their general abilities across curriculums are not at the same place as their reading and their writing and their spelling. So we see a difference between those two. And we're looking at the child who's got average intelligence, who's had access to education, and we're saying, why is this child's writing well below what I would expect them to be, what I would expect their potential to be? Maybe they're writing using simple words that they already know how to spell in simple sentence structures, even though if they told you the story, that they would be able to tell you the story with a great deal more sophistication. So those are some of the characteristics that we see when we're looking at children who would be identified as dyslexic.
Thank you so much for that really science-based approach. Are there any common misconceptions about dyslexia that may show up for outsiders, even some students who may have dyslexia, that we can dispel?
Sure. Well, sometimes people think that dyslexic children, that dyslexia has to do with reversals of letters, and that is common in young children, but should go away. So handwriting is an area where parents will often look at it and say, my child is doing something weird with their handwriting. That may be a different issue. Oftentimes we think that children who are dyslexic too, are that they're not very smart, that something is broken about them, and they have that same idea as well. But in fact, children with dyslexia have average or above average intelligence. So those are a couple of the misconceptions.
Thank you. And that leads really well into my next question, which is, you mentioned sometimes that issue of self-esteem and can really become a major issue for students that may have been diagnosed with dyslexia or may have it without being diagnosed. How do we help the child kind of rewrite their own personal narrative to not look at this as sort of a defect or something that's wrong with them?
Right. So children who have been struggling with reading and writing and have that difficulty with spelling are really aware of it at a very young age, even though they can't articulate it. They know that there's something different about them, that they're trying hard. They want to please the adults around them. But no matter what they do, they're not able to be successful. And that may be in large part to the kinds of instruction that they're receiving in the classroom, which is a topic for another time. But that those children start to feel badly about themselves and start writing a story about who they are, that there's something wrong with them, that they can't do what it is that the other children can do. And that gets compounded over time. And often those children will begin to engage in behaviors to distract the adults from the fact that they are poor readers and writers and spellers. And that might look like negative behaviors. If everybody's focused on them behaving badly, then they're less focused on this other thing that they can't figure out how to do. And that emotional component really impacts people lifelong. Adults who are dyslexic, who are identified as adults, talk about how their inabilities as a child, they didn't even know that they were inabilities. They just knew something was wrong with them. Fundamentally, they felt like they were broken in some way, that they were deficient. And nobody ever taught to them about how that could be different because nobody knew how to help them. So one of the ways that we support children when we begin to educate adults is to be able to say, we can look at some of the ways that we can help to build children's skills. And that when we help children grow their skills, then the children start to have concrete evidence that in fact they aren't broken, that they can learn. And as their competence goes up, their confidence also goes up. That growing those skills helps the child feel like, I can do it, I am capable. And that impacts all of their learning and starts to help them to change the narrative around who they are as a learner. The other piece that's really important that I'll slip in is talking to them about that this is a brain training issue, really, that it's not a personality issue. It's not a can't do, try harder issue. It's just about developing those neural pathways in the brain. And when we do X work, whatever it is, that we're laying down those pathways. And children begin to see, especially older children, that really what they're doing is just growing the neural pathways in their brain. And we depersonalize it that way so that it's not about them as a person. It's just about stimulating their brain to develop neural pathways.
Absolutely. That was such a powerful explanation. Thank you. I also appreciate the comment about neurodiverse children in general, not just with dyslexia, who can experience a lot of self-worth issues from an early age. This happens when we have a system of education that we are, for various systemic reasons, unable to provide appropriate accommodations, differentiating appropriately, and all of those things. Absolutely, Tana, making new roads. That is so, so important. All right, we are going to move on to our next panelist, Corrine, to get a perspective from someone who is working in schools and with children in literacy. So, Corrine, what is support right now for students with dyslexia in schools, and what should it look like?
So, for the most part, what supports, and please forgive me, but I kind of need to take these three questions kind of together, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
So, what supports are needed for students? Number one is a teacher who is supported enough and educated enough. Okay. And when I say that, I don't mean educated on teaching. What I mean is educated on how to teach to these specific types of students. The children can't learn if their teacher hasn't been taught to teach them. As a middle school teacher, a lot of what I say in staff meetings and just in meetings in general and in conversations is, when I went through teacher college, I learned how to help students read to learn, not how to learn to read. So by the time they get to me, the expectation is that they are competent readers, but that's not always the case. What supports are needed for students are, of course, one, believe it or not, legislation, right? Because in a lot of situations, teachers' hands are tied by the standards and the expectations that are placed upon us. So we can't do the things that we know our students need, or we feel as if we are limited in the things that we know our students need. I actually took some notes on my chalkboard while the previous presenter was presenting, because a lot of what she reminded me of was project-based learning and alternate assessments. If a student is unable, for whatever reason, to write their answer, there needs to be a support in place for that student to have a scribe or to dictate. Because just because they are unable to write their answer does not necessarily mean that they haven't grasped the concept and that they haven't mastered the standard. The other thing is, once students are able to learn that there are tools and there are ways to build skills so that they can read better, they'll start to use them. I see it in my classroom all the time. Once they've been taught to do those things, they do them. So a lot of what we see in schools is that opportunity gap rather than an achievement gap, because what we find is these students don't have the access to the tools that they need to be successful for several reasons. And of course, there is that family connection. Support for students with dyslexia in school should look like their families should be totally engaged in their educational process. Um, and like was previously mentioned, a lot of times we find that parents are hesitant to have their students enrolled in programming that will assist them because either A, they went through a similar system and they didn't like it as a child. B, if they admit that their child is not reading correctly, right, they'll realize that they're also not reading correctly. And that is something that is kind of difficult to navigate as an adult, right? And then, of course, there is this concern about labeling children, right? Um, so there needs to also be this family connection and this family piece in that. And of course, it should also look like building students' confidence. And one of the ways to do that, of course, is through this project-based learning, is through alternative assessments, but also through a technique that I learned, 110. And I don't really think that's the name of it, but it's basically for every negative comment a child hears, they should hear 10 positive comments. So kind of navigating that. Also, growth mindset is huge when thinking about working with students, especially students with dyslexia, because once they start to have those connections made in their brain, or they are taught the tools necessary to make it easier for them to navigate literacy, it becomes a lot easier to do those other things. But it's important to also build that confidence as they go. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, a compliment about their reading. Growth mindset really helps me personally think about the fact that they haven't got it yet. I call it like the power of yet, right? Because they might not have it yet, but they will get it if they have the proper supports. So those are kind of some of the supports that teachers need. Those are kind of some of the supports that students need. And those are some of the supports, and those are some of the ways that education should look for dyslexic students in schools.
Thank you so much for that amazing wrap up and overview of really what is needed. It is a complex issue, not unlike dyslexia itself, for what students actually need and what needs to happen both on an individual level in schools, but also on a systemic level in schools. Thank you so much, Corrine. Allow me 1 second I see that my slides have disappeared temporarily. Let me 1 second to bring those right back up. I appreciate all of your patience. We all know we've lived on technology for so long, and yet it still is sometimes the bane of our existence. Oh, here we go.
I love that we're at the point now that really just doesn't phase anyone, and meetings continue because we've all been in this space and we just keep moving. So we all get it.
Well, I have the slide. If you want me to go ahead and read it and start talking, I can do that too.
Perfect.
It has just been pulled up. Susan, you are our next panelist. If you would like to go ahead, because it is still loading. If you wouldn't mind, it would be so kind. Thank you for reading as a panelist.
Sure. So when the slide comes up, it's going to say, what brief recommendations do we have? And the slide reads, based on these shared understandings, what should we keep in mind when teaching, tutoring, or otherwise working with students with dyslexia? One thing I want to clarify, when we're in a public schools don't diagnose dyslexia. What public schools are doing are looking for characteristics of dyslexia. Students, even when a school psychologist does a comprehensive evaluation, they can look at some things that they will classify as a specific reading disability. But for a diagnosis of dyslexia, there's a pretty in-depth evaluation that takes place that is usually not done within the school district. So it's irrelevant at some level, because if we have students that are exhibiting characteristics of dyslexia, it is our job as the people in the schools to make sure we give them the support they need to be successful. So that, I think, is very important. So a child doesn't need to have that label or have to go outside and get a very expensive evaluation. We are responsible for a couple things. We have to have valid and reliable screening instruments in the schools so that we can find those children's individual deficits that lead us down the path of, these are characteristics of dyslexia, so we better put in the supports that they need. I think one of the problems that happens, and I've worked with a lot of kids in the upper grades and adults, is that when they're taking a lot of these standardized tests, it will show poor comprehension. And they'll say, well, this student has poor comprehension. Gee whiz, they always have poor comprehension. Nobody is taking a step back and saying, maybe we need to screen to see what their phonetic knowledge is. Do they know the letter sounds? Do they know how to blend, like Kristin was saying earlier? And they're not doing that in schools. I've seen this year after year when I've brought that up where I've taught that, how about I do this particular screener? Once I see sort of the lay of the land, it's like, oh, now we know what to support them with. I think the other thing, and that was mentioned earlier, some of the secondary consequences that come up with these students have to do with really low self-esteem. And I think when we see some of the behaviors coming out, some of the fighting, some of the back-talking, the trying to get away from assignments and not wanting to do them, the avoidance behavior, I think if we do our due diligence at really screening and looking for what is causing some of their difficulties with writing a paper or understanding what they read, we will actually unlock some information that will allow us to really support that child with foundational skills that somehow were missed in the early grades. It might have been because they are dyslexic, or it might have been that they were given the kinds of instruction that were really more whole language based, that really didn't dig into the foundational skills of how letters and symbols and sounds and all that works together. I think that those are the major things that I would look at. And of course, we have to talk about the way we work with these kids. And the only way it's going to happen is to make sure our professionals have the knowledge that they need. And those opportunities are happening now around the state with something called letters training and Orton Gillingham training and different things that the state now is actually paying for teachers to have access to. And that's an amazing thing. And I think we're going to see it in the next budget year. So, no longer can we say, well, teachers don't have access. We've got to make sure they have access. Now the free stuff is there. Schools have to find subs. They have to make sure these teachers know what to do when they see these problems.
Thank you so much, Susan. I really appreciate, especially earlier, you were really getting into, this is also kind of a disciplinary kind of issue, right? When we see children acting out, it's not an immediate, we need to assign a consequence. And I know that I saw this a lot when I was a teacher in the classroom of, there's not really a whole lot of investigation in terms of why this behavior may have occurred, what were some antecedents to this, what could be an underlying issue, and really trying to look at students from a holistic child perspective instead of you're not aligning. Corrine, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this or if you have any experience with these types of things in your classroom as well that you might want to speak on.
So sure, yes. That is actually one of the biggest things that we see in the classrooms, especially as students get older and they really want to kind of, I mean, let's just be honest, right? It's kind of embarrassing not to be able to read. Let's just, call a spade a spade. It's embarrassing not to be able to read. And a lot of times teachers don't really understand the impact that their words have. Their intent might be good, but the impact sometimes is lifelong. I've heard positive stories. We all have that positive story about a teacher who went above and beyond that we all love, right? But then a lot of us have these stories that are kind of traumatic for whatever reason. And so sometimes it's a lot easier for teachers to react rather than be kind of plan something ahead of time, right? But when teachers are trained to spot the reading issues that a student might be having, they get a different understanding of the behaviors that might be exhibiting. But a lot of times, one of the first indicators that there is actually an issue going on is not all the time in the content, but it's in the behaviors. Because if they're embarrassed that they can't read or can't read well, they're going to try and distract the teacher from that fact. They're going to try and distract their peers from that fact. And I mean, one of the things that I always say to my students is, you can't hide from me, because as an educator, I see you and I know what those behaviors indicate. So I know you can't read, right? I know you're struggling, and I know that's why you're behaving this way. So a lot of times, one of the indicators is also behavior, because they are trying to hide the fact that they can't do these tasks well. And as a result, it further impacts their ability to learn the tools necessary to be successful. Because a lot of times they'll wind up in in-school suspension. They'll wind up in the principal's office, in the dean's office. They'll wind up with the out-of-school suspension, whatever the case may be, where one, they're not in the classroom getting the attention, but two, they're further labeled. And that really impacts the way that a teacher might view that student coming into the classroom, but also it impacts that student's experience at school and making school a not so safe, or rather a not so brave space for them to take those risks with their education.
Absolutely. I think, again, I really want to lift up, teacher is like, I see you, and it's not serving you to try to blend in with your peers, even though we understand that. Especially, I taught teenagers at high school, right? They all wanted to be loved and accepted by their peers. They didn't want to be embarrassed by the fact that maybe they weren't able to read aloud in the same way that their peers might have been able to. And again, I really appreciate Tana's comments about there could be a really high level of like listening comprehension, right? Listening and oral, but their actual scores in reading for the M-STEP or the MAP are not at the same level. And Susan, you had put a comment here if you wanted to speak a little bit to that as well.
Most teachers, I mean, I'm a teacher. Some of us are teachers here. Generally speaking, we liked school. A lot of us like to read. Reading didn't come really hard to us. I think sometimes it's really hard for us to wrap our head around when we're working with children and we're showing them the stuff. And of course, we're using methods we were taught in college. Most of them, a lot of them actually aren't very effective. And the kids aren't catching on. And we're thinking, what is this? Why isn't this child catching on? Because they just have their own experience of how learning to read wasn't that hard. So I think sometimes they don't realize how horrible it is when you can't read. And I've seen little children that I've had in the early grades that can just be very difficult in class. And once they start to learn to read, you start to see another human being come out of this child. Like all of a sudden they'll sit up straight more. They'll, oh, no, I want to read that, or I want to write that. And it just changes who they are. So it has such a huge impact. And I work with adults, and the stories I've heard from my adults at the community college level, when they write, there was a writing assignment about a memoir about their life. And it's just stunning, the effects and how it has left, it's a trauma experience for them and has far-reaching reactions in their adult life, especially if they've never gotten help. And of course, they're in these classes with me in remedial reading, and it's the lights are coming on and you can see them just thinking, oh, I'm not stupid, which, how sad that they've had to go through that.
Absolutely. Tana, I can only imagine what an amazing resource that you are as a teacher who also has dyslexia. I would love to hear more about the experience that some of your students have, but unfortunately, in the interest of time, we do have to move on from this amazing conversation. We're going to shift a little bit into some things that families could do if they might be wondering if their child has dyslexia. Kristin, you discussed some observable behaviors earlier that could indicate maybe a screening needs to happen. So what are some next steps for families?
Well, I'm reflecting on the conversation we're just having. And one of the key components of helping the child through those issues that we're talking about is to put skills in their hands. And one of the ways that parents can support their children if they suspect that their child is dyslexic, they can get tested. That's an avenue. And another avenue is to put skills in the parents' hands that they can use with the children, or to seek out a tutor who is Orton Gillingham trained and has those skills around structured literacy, who can help their child so that their child can get the help that they need if the school isn't going to provide it. And unfortunately, schools won't provide that help, even if they know how. They often won't provide that help until there's quite a big gap between the child's age and their level of reading. So for young children, they benefit from having those skills really early on. It makes it easier for them to catch up with their peers and maintain that growth. And by the time they're in kindergarten and first grade, really. But it doesn't mean that at any age we can't give those children those skills. Some of the ways that parents can support their children, in addition to getting tested or asking for testing through their school, and they can do that. You can ask for testing through your school, and your school is required to give it. But Susan already explained some of the reasons that might be tricky, and you might not get the result that you're looking for. You could also hire somebody and get a private screening through a neuropsychologist, which is often expensive, and schools still may or may not be responsive to that. So those two avenues are available. And the one I always encourage parents, and I often work with a lot of homeschool parents and parents who have children who are struggling and may have limited resources, that they can give themselves, they can train themselves how to do some of the pieces that are helpful, some of the instructional strategies that are helpful for them to be able to lay down those neural pathways, help their children lay down those neural pathways. And one of the pieces that we've touched on over and over very lightly is around parents providing their children with opportunities to hear books. So listening to stories, fiction and nonfiction stories, is incredibly important, and a way that parents can very easily impact their child's educational experience globally. Because when the children listen to all of those stories, they grow their vocabulary, which they miss out on by not reading all the books. They grow their vocabulary, and the easiest way to do that is by hearing words used in context. And they also grow their understanding of what the written word sounds like, so that even if they're doing what Corrine was suggesting and they're using a scribe to dictate the report of their story, they have an understanding of what written work sounds like, that they may not have read a bunch of written work, but they've heard it read to them. And it accomplishes another piece, which is called background knowledge. And older children who are struggling readers, They may or may not be dyslexic. They often have this phonological deficit about being able to hear the sounds and attach them to letters and decode and encode. But another piece of that can be just really low vocabulary and low background knowledge. And that's an area where parents can play a huge role in impacting their child's education overall. Because while they're listening to all of those written stories, fiction and nonfiction, the children are gaining a body of knowledge that is important in understanding the world in which they live, but also will support their reading growth whenever they're given that opportunity to gain those skills, whether it's first grade, third grade, when they're 15, or maybe when they're 25.
Thank you so much, Kristin, for that comprehensive discussion, especially around skills. I would love to highlight some links that we've had in the comments. I just want to say them aloud again. We'll definitely include a longer list of resources once this is kind of posted and archived on our Facebook page, as well as on the 313reads.org website. Things like free ebooks and books from the Detroit Public Library. If you're not already a member of libraries, especially the Detroit Public Library, I highly recommend that you do so. Free tutoring in the Detroit area, cdcmich.org. Epic free online for teachers, dyslexiaida.org, right? This is fantastic resources that families can take on their own to be able to give the skills to their students. Ooh, amazing question. As a future evaluator, what would you recommend for us to ensure we see pathways for educational systems to recognize students with disabilities such as dyslexia and provide improvement? Amazing. Evidence-based resources. Would anyone else like to kind of tackle this question as we're coming up on sort of the end of our session?
Would you recommend for us to ensure we see pathways for I want to make sure I understand the question. I think, and please clarify if I'm going down the wrong road here, but I think it's how do we make systems respond to this? And I think the way we make systems respond to children with dyslexia or characteristics of dyslexia or other learning issues is that, first of all, you have to have a knowledge base, and that's missing right now. And that's why, in the legislation, which was mentioned earlier in a comment, there has to be knowledge infused as to what the science tells us about teaching reading. And if it's done according to the science, it will help all children, but is crucial for those children who have characteristics of dyslexia or dyslexia. So systemically, nothing will change until we insert the knowledge base. And then you have to have a framework, and the MTSS, the multi-tiered system of support, which is also in the legislation, is a framework in which we do valid and reliable screening. We look at, where the deficits are, and we set up a plan of support. And then we constantly progress monitor the student to make sure that that student is making the kind of progress and we're making the kind of adjustments. And then, so I would say those things have to happen systemically. And you'll notice if you look at the legislation, part of that training that we're saying needs to happen to not just teachers, but to principals, administrators that are in charge of curriculum and assessments. They need to understand what we need to do in those two spaces of assessment and instruction. So I hope I answered your question, but to me that you have to have systems change. And that's why what you see around the country, when there are these big, huge initiatives like just went through happening in North Carolina, already happened in Mississippi and other states, they're moving the whole system because you can't, I was just doing it in my classroom, but that's just me with those students all the kids deserve to have the proper instruction.
Thank you so much, Susan. And if you wanted to kind of transition along, you're already discussing about implications for policy, but if you wanted to talk specifically about the 4 Senate bills that were mentioned or specific implications that we have going on for Michigan policy and legislative process right now, that could be amazing supports for students with dyslexia. Yeah,
it was I think that this legislation is a very thoughtful piece of writing. And, the idea was to look at other states and decide how do we, in a comprehensive manner, really change the system of the way things are being delivered in the state. And as I mentioned, there are components to these 4 bills. One of the great things about these bills, besides what's in them, is that it's bipartisan. So that means we have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans in the 4-bill package. And this is really important because making sure children learn to read should have nothing to do with politics. This is what, it's an important job that our educational systems are doing. So we've got the things that are included in the legislation are training, both pre-service teachers and current teachers in the school districts. And it isn't just teachers. As I mentioned, it's principals, it's school psychologists, it's speech and language people, anybody that deals or interfaces with reading and reading interventions or support need to have certain knowledge about how the reading brain works. We've also tried to be very specific about the kinds of things that need to be included in a valid and reliable assessment. We know the 3rd grade reading law passed in 2016, I think. And they put in there, you have to do screening and you have to progress monitor if kids need it. But they weren't very specific about what that valid and reliable screening should include. And so we've tried to actually list the kinds of components that are looking for the characteristics of dyslexia, which are the same things we need to make sure that all kids are able to do. And then another piece that I think is important is, in order for a teacher going forward to get recertified with their license or to be certified for the first time, if you are one of those people, a K-6 teacher, a special ed teacher, a literacy coach, etc., that is in that realm of teaching reading or supporting reading, you have to have this training before you're given a certificate in Michigan, because that's the only way that things are actually going to change. Mm-hmm. Because it's much easier to just stay with what we've always done. But with 40% of our children being proficient readers, that's just not acceptable. So I think that gives you an overview. I can tell you the legislation is sitting now on the Senate floor waiting for all the senators to vote. And it's in the House waiting to be heard in the House Education Committee. And so a lot of people have put a lot of time into this. We've had a lot of reading experts, dyslexia experts, assessment experts, just people that have all over the country that have informed this legislation. And all your voices are going to help us get it across the finish line.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Susan. I really appreciate the highlighting of, we all know that there are many levels to what we need to do in order to improve literacy levels across the state of Michigan and specifically in Detroit, right? There are things that can happen in classrooms and in schools, but we also need those larger systemic things to change so that those changes can be long lasting and sustaining. Mm-hmm. All right. We are moving into the end of our session. Before we get to our final takeaways that all of our panelists, I want to remind you that we are going to be doing a book giveaway very soon. So if you would like to be entered into the raffle to win Dyslexia, Wrestling with an Octopus, 10 Tips to Help Your Child Thrive in Every Aspect of Life, Academically, Socially, and Physically, please go to this tiny URL, tinyurl.com/LFCA Series 1. Right after we do this final takeaways from all of our panelists, I'm going to be spinning the wheel of names to see who wins this, and we'll be reaching out to you further. So this is your last chance to be entered into the raffle. Again, that is tinyurl.com/LFCA Series 1. All right, panelists, what is one takeaway that you would like for all of our participants to have after this session? Kristin, I'm going to go ahead and start with you.
I think that the takeaway that's really important to me for us to remember about children with dyslexia is they feel like they need to go from being poor readers to proficient readers, but that every step along the way can be celebrated. And one of my students I used to tutor, she did a video for our website that was around getting rid of the practice makes perfect saying, and that practice makes progress. And acknowledging those small steps and allowing children to revel in their progress is really important to me when we focus on the child aspect of this work.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kristin. Corrine, would love to hear your final takeaway for all of our participants.
So it's actually two. And a question, believe it or not. So my first takeaway is this is a top-down issue. It has to start with the legislation. The legislation has to be in place for one, for teachers to feel comfortable doing some of those things that we need to do. But also it gives us the support that we need to make those things happen. It's funny that 313 Reads mentions finding that there's a link to find your senator for a template to write a letter expressing your support for the dyslexia legislation, because my question actually was going to be, as parents, as students, as educators, what can we do to push this bill forward? Because without our voices being heard, without us advocating for our students advocating for themselves, our parents advocating for our students, legislators won't know how important this issue is, because they're not in the classroom with these students every day. They don't go home with these students or with these children, right? Because now they're being transitioned back to their parents' care. They don't go home to these children who are traumatized by school because they can't read as well as they should or as well as they could. The next takeaway that I have, and this is really the biggest one, is there is nothing wrong with my babies. There is absolutely nothing wrong with my babies. This is not an achievement gap. They are brilliant. They are ready. They are willing, but it's an opportunity gap because they don't have the resources that they need to do those things. And that's like the biggest takeaway I have, is that there's nothing wrong with my babies. We just need some help.
Absolutely.
Correct.
Couldn't agree with you more than 100%. Susan, what is your takeaway?
Corrine, you are right. And I think the hardest thing for me, because so many of my years I worked in the city in Lansing. And I think this is something that affects everybody, whether you have money, whether you don't have money. But let's be real. It is more difficult for the families that are struggling financially, because I see this where I live now in Ann Arbor. There are parents that will go and get private tutors. And then we have the children that are, I have a little foster child I'm working with in Detroit. They could not pay a tutor. So we have to take care of this in the schools. Everybody should have equal access. And I will tell you that this is a huge opportunity. If these bills pass, this is going to be the beginning of what we saw in Mississippi, which was always the lowest in reading scores. And they're the only state that have been showing gains compared to where they were. And so we know that it works. And if you are uncomfortable, I just want to kind of give a plug for that website for the bills. If you're uncomfortable with, I don't know what to write as a letter, etc., if you go to the mydyslexialaws.com, there is a letter already written, and you can find your legislator on there. You can send it. Please be aware that on there it will list some of the members, who's the chair of this committee and that committee. Right now, we need to go after the speaker, the head of the Senate. His name is Senator Shirkey, because he will make the decision whether to vote on it in the Senate, because it's made it all the way to the Senate floor. In the House, we need to focus on Senator Pam Hornberger. She runs the Education Committee. It is now up to her to take the bills up in her committee. Then we'll move them to the House floor. And then, of course, they'll come together and go to the governor. So make calls. Phone calls are good. Leave voicemail after voicemail. They've got to feel the heat. I spent some time in the legislature, and I'm here to tell you, your voices matter. And of course, contact your own legislator, but you've got to talk to these people in leadership, because they're the ones that are going to decide when the bills move. Okay. So I feel very excited to be on this panel with people that I know are in this same fight. And I'm excited to that I've been able to see all these great comments. So thanks again for having me as part of this today.
Thank you, Susan, for that wonderful wrap up. We are now going to move into the book raffle giveaway right before we go to a Q&A piece. So any and all audience members will be able to ask any questions that you have of our panelists very soon. Before we go into the book giveaway raffle, here are a couple of links. Again, just a couple. We are going to curate a much longer list of resources for you all. UMich Dyslexia Help, the University of Michigan, has a great resource on debunking myths about dyslexia. Emily Hanford from American Public Media. This is just one of many essays and articles that she has written. This specific one talks about how many kids struggle with reading and children of color are far less likely to get the help that they need. Again, dyslexia and literacy is very much an equity issue, and we need to keep that at the forefront of our mind. Finally, the Purple Challenge. If you have not heard of this before, this is a great example of whole language or balanced literacy versus structured literacy. These links, these tiny URLs, as well as all of the other amazing links and resources that we have seen in the comments today, will be organized very soon on our Facebook and on our website. Okay, audience member book raffle. Can we get a drum roll for the Wheel of Names? Drum roll. Okay. Doing it here on the screen so that people know that I'm not lying.
Can I just say how excited I am about this? These books have been sitting here ready for us to give out, and I'm just like, oh, can't wait.
All right, here's the spin. Lauren Hedrick, congratulations. You have won Dyslexia Wrestling with an Octopus. We will be reaching out via email for a mailing address so that we can get that sent to you as soon as possible. Congratulations, Lauren. All right, we have moved into the Q&A. I believe there might have been a Q&A question that popped up a minute ago. If we want to maybe go back and start with that. Tana asked, is there money in the proposed education budget for it? So Governor Whitmer's new proposed budget, is there money in this legislation? Panelists, maybe Susan, do you know if there's money?
Yeah, so what we know in the last K-12 budget, there was $4 million set aside for letters training, which is happening right now. That's through Lexia, the company, and they're teaching structured literacy and how the reading brain works, and it's just an excellent program. And then there was $1 million for Orton Gillingham training, which was being done by two organizations. The one I'm most familiar with is the Michigan Dyslexia Institute. So those funds are now being looked at by the appropriations committees to re-up for the next budget. And we're hoping to get increases. So working very hard to do that. So this is sort of laying the groundwork, because if the bills pass, it will be, you've got to give universities and schools time to change their system to, do certain things. And that's usually how bills do. They don't just flip the switch. So if it takes 2 years to actually go into full enactment, during that time, we're hoping to still be working with all the teachers and the educators around the state to get them ready with the training. So we're hopes that at this time, at least for the training component, which is really the thing that costs the money, is already happening. Not quite at the level we want, but we're working on that. I hope that answered your question.
Amazing. And I just wanted to reemphasize the comment. So there's $4 million for letters and $1 million for the Orton Gillingham funds currently being reviewed. So that is our money. Any other questions from our panelists, or for our panelists rather? Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. All right, I have one last question that I think we might want to end on if there are no other further comments. So this is for all of you. If there is one thing that you could change kind of immediately related to dyslexia education, access to resources for students, like something that if you could flip a switch and it was totally changed tomorrow, what would you do? What would that be?
If I could flip a switch and just open up all the brains and pour it in. I would like everybody that has anything to do with reading to learn about structured literacy and what the science tells us about reading. And I know that everybody has to go on their journey. I mean, I was trained in a Big Ten school with the approach of reading whole language. They didn't call it balanced literacy back then, and I used those things for 9 years, and thank goodness I found other training. But that to me would have probably the biggest impact from my perspective.
And I think from my perspective that I agree, Susan, right? If we only had a magic wand, that I would love to be able to see that there is a tutor in every neighborhood, that every street corner has somebody who has that same download of knowledge that Susan's talking about, who can help the children who are past that K-1-2 place, maybe regardless of their age or their ability, and the adults that Corrine was speaking about, that whole families can gain in their literacy skills under the guidance of a loving tutor who's somebody that they connect with because they're in their locality, and that those people provide a second tier of support for the schools and that a wraparound service, if you will. So I would extend that bubble beyond the school into the neighborhoods.
If I had a magic wand, I would do two things. First, I would invite every legislator to spend 1 month inside of my classroom with my salary. That's first. But if I really, really had a magic wand, I would do whatever was needed so that a child's zip code, a child's socioeconomic status, a child's family, a child's whatever does not impact their ability to access what they need to be great readers.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I appreciate all of this. Sometimes the best actionable steps can come from what do we want to happen immediately, and then how do we actually get there within steps, right? So, so powerful.
Amber, can I add one thing to that?
Absolutely.
So I think about it's both looking forward and looking back. So as someone who was a graduate director of literacy, didn't understand so much of what I understand now. And I want to wave this one to say, like, as we know better, we do better. And we need to recognize that literacy is continuing to grow in our evidence base, that we're still, in our toddler years of that. And as we, really better understand that we have a professional, moral, ethical obligation to change what we do. I want to go back to the people I trained and say, I got it wrong. I can do better. I didn't know, right? But now that I do, I want to do better. And I still encounter quite candidly, like university faculty who will say things like, well, I believe in whole language, which is educational malpractice, in my opinion. It's sort of like someone who knows there's a safer way to do a root canal, but just says, I don't care, I'm kicking it old school and does it some way that's grossly outdated. So it's that we all get to this space where we norm, when we learn more and have to reassess what we're doing and change it, that's a good thing. That's the growth mindset we were talking about, right? Like that happens in any field, and that we just get to a space where we can have that openness to say, we're all going to continue learning and doing better collectively. And it's a good thing. And it doesn't mean pinging back and forth, because we see that a lot in schools, right? Well, we tried that for 6 months. It didn't work. We're moving on. But just really continuing to build a body of knowledge around evidence-based reading, and really commit to enacting that in the classroom. That's what I'm excited to see happen.
Can I just piggyback? Can I piggyback on what you just said? You know what amazing thing happened in Mississippi? They offered the training to university professors. And when we put out the list of these pieces by Emily Hanford, she interviews these professors, and they're saying things like, I didn't even know this. And they're training teachers how to teach reading. So you're right. There's a lot of people, once we're all brought into the same knowledge base, wow, great things are going to happen, right? But that's got to happen. Oh my, yeah.
Wow. Well, I just want to say a wholehearted thank you to all of our panelists and everyone who has joined us today on Facebook. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, learning about dyslexia, some of the things that we know we need to change and some of the ways to change them. If you could take 2 minutes to give us some feedback on our sessions that we can improve for the next session, please go to tinyurl.com/LFCA feedback, tinyurl.com/LFCA feedback. You can reach us at 313reads.org or at 313reads. You're already on our Facebook page. You can catch Kristin at brainfriendlyreading.org or at brainfriendlyreading or at West Hall Read. Corrine, I don't know if you wanted your personal apps, but you did include some links to Sampson Middle School and AKA. So I included those there as well. Susan, if you wanted to plug anywhere that people can find you, would love to have that. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today.
Just really quickly, it's at we shall read. We Shall Read is the nonprofit arm of Brain Friendly Reading that provides support for teachers and parents and tutors.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for championing this, Amber. Grateful for you.
Absolutely.
Thank
Everyone
you,
have
Amber.
a good week.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.